Marcus Hill woke up at 4:30 every morning without an alarm, not because he had to, because he wanted to. There was something sacred about those early hours. The city still dark, the streets still empty, the world not yet awake enough to form an opinion about him. He would stand in the kitchen of his apartment, brew a single cup of black coffee, and spend 30 quiet minutes just thinking, not about money, not about power, about food. About the way a slow braised short rib could tell you something honest about patience. About how a perfectly balanced sauce could teach you more about restraint than any philosophy book ever written. Marcus Hill believed in food the way other men believed in religion, with his whole chest, without apology, without needing anyone else to understand why. He was 34 years old, 6 feet even, with broad shoulders that filled out his chef's whites in a way that spoke more of hard labor than of vanity. His hands were calloused and scarred from years at the stove burn marks that traced the history of every dish he had ever perfected. He had grown up on the south side of Chicago, the kind of neighborhood where ambition was either crushed early or forged into something unbreakable. For Marcus, it had been the latter. His grandmother had taught him to cook, his father had taught him to work, and the city itself had taught him to endure. He carried all 3 lessons with him every single day, folded into his posture like a quiet declaration that he would not be moved. The restaurant where he worked was called Ember and Salt, a narrow, warm-lit spot tucked between a dry cleaner and a hardware store on a block in Wicker Park that had been trying to gentrify for the better part of a decade. It seated 42 people, had a wine list that was modest but thoughtful, and served food that made grown adults close their eyes and exhale slowly without realizing they were doing it. Marcus was the head chef. He had been there for 3 years, and in that time, the restaurant had earned a reputation that far exceeded its square footage. Food critics whispered about it. Regulars drove 40 minutes across the city just to sit at the counter and watch him work. But none of that had changed Marcus. He was still the first one through the door every morning, and the last one to leave every night. He still swept the back entrance himself. He still sat with the dishwasher, a 22-year-old kid named Terrell, and ate staff meal before service started, never at a separate table, never making a show of hierarchy. He tipped generously, quietly, without making anyone thank him for it. When a line cook's car broke down, Marcus covered the repair bill and told the man to forget it happened. When a server went through a divorce and came in visibly shaking one Tuesday afternoon, Marcus sent her home with 2 weeks of pay and told the owner she had a family emergency. He never asked for recognition for any of it. That was simply who he was. A man who had been overlooked enough times to understand exactly what it cost a person to be invisible, and who had made a private decision long ago that he would never be the one to make someone else feel that way. Vanessa Pruitt had been his girlfriend for 2 years. She was beautiful in the kind of way that made rooms rearrange themselves when she walked in, tall and angular, with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and a wardrobe that told you she had studied the language of status and was fluent in every dialect. She worked in marketing for a boutique firm downtown and spent her weekends brunch hopping across the North Side with a group of friends who measured the quality of a Saturday by the price of the cocktail menu. She was smart and driven and restless in the specific way that comes from wanting more than your current life can offer, which is not itself a flaw, but the direction in which that restlessness points determines everything. Vanessa had started dating Marcus when his quiet steadiness felt like strength. But somewhere in the second year, steadiness had started to feel like stagnation. She watched her friends date men in finance, men in tech, men who drove cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries. And then she would come home, and Marcus would be there in a plain white t-shirt, watching film of other chefs' technique on his laptop, and something in her chest would tighten, with a feeling she did not yet have the honesty to name. She began finding reasons to feel embarrassed. His car, a 2009 Civic, with a dent in the rear quarter panel that he refused to fix because the engine ran fine, became a source of quiet shame. His clothes, which were clean and well-fitted but never expensive, became evidence of a ceiling she believed he could not see. She started declining invitations to events where she would have to introduce him as a chef, offering the word like an apology. At a birthday dinner for her friend Kelsey, held at a rooftop bar in River North, Marcus arrived in a dark button-down and slacks well-dressed by any reasonable standard, but not the kind of dress that made people at that table lean in with curiosity. Someone at the far end, A man named Brett, who worked in private equity and had a laugh like a car alarm, made a joke about Marcus's profession that stopped just short of being something Marcus could directly respond to. Vanessa did not defend him. She laughed, just slightly, in that terrible way people do when they are more afraid of social cost than they are loyal to the person sitting next to them. Marcus had looked at her in that moment not with anger, but with a quiet, clear-eyed recognition that settled into him like a cold stone dropping to the bottom of a still pool. He said nothing. He finished his drink. He drove home in the dented Civic, and in the silence of that drive, he allowed himself to understand something he had been not quite ready to understand before. He was still thinking about it 3 days later when Vanessa mentioned, casually, while scrolling through her phone at the kitchen table, that she had received a dinner invitation from someone named Damien Cole. Damien Cole was the kind of man who had learned very early that wealth was a performance, and he had spent the better part of his 38 years perfecting the show. He had made his money in real estate development, not the boring, methodical kind that required patience and long-term thinking, but the flashy, high-leverage kind that required charisma, timing, and an exceptional tolerance for other people's money being at risk. He drove a matte black Lamborghini Urus that he had leased, though he told everyone he owned it outright. His watch collection was real 5 figures per piece, arranged in a glass case in his penthouse like trophies from a war he had won single-handedly. He wore his wealth the way a theater actor wears a costume loudly, deliberately, so that no one in the back row could miss the point. He had met Vanessa at a networking event 2 weeks earlier, and he had zeroed in on her with the efficient precision of someone who categorized people quickly and moved accordingly. She was beautiful and hungry. Hungry for status. Hungry for the kind of life that looked good from the outside. And Damien Cole had made a career out of recognizing exactly that combination. He knew the script. He had run it before. A dinner invitation, a restaurant that required reservations 3 months in advance, a car that pulled up to the curb like a statement, and then the slow, calculated unwrapping of the life he was offering. It worked almost every time. He appeared at Vanessa's workplace on a Wednesday afternoon, pulling up to the glass-fronted building in the Lamborghini, with the kind of theatrical precision that told you the timing was not an accident. Vanessa's colleagues pressed against the lobby windows. Her friend Jade, who had been rooting for this particular outcome since the networking event, grabbed her arm and hissed something that sounded like upgrade. Damien stepped out of the car in a charcoal suit that cost more than most mortgages, smiled at Vanessa with the full wattage of a man who had never been told no, and opened the passenger door with a small, studied bow. It was a performance, but performances have a way of feeling real when you are already looking for permission to believe them. He took her to Alinea, the kind of restaurant that does not appear on any app, because the people who eat there already know where it is. The kind of place where the menu is a multi-hour experience, and the sommelier is better dressed than most wedding guests. Damien made a show of knowing the maitre d' by name, of waving off the wine list in favor of something already arranged, of speaking about the food, with the confident vagueness of a man who had eaten there before, but paid more attention to his dining companion's reaction than to the food itself. Vanessa was dazzled, not because she was stupid. She was not stupid, but because she was being offered exactly the narrative she had already written for herself in the privacy of her own ambitions. 3 days after that dinner, Damien showed up at a gathering of Vanessa's friends at a bar in Lincoln Park, and this time Marcus was there. The encounter was not accidental on Damien's part, though Vanessa would later tell herself it was. Damien walked in, assessed Marcus in approximately 4 seconds, and made a calculation. He began flirting with Vanessa openly, directly, with the casual ownership of a man who does not acknowledge competitors because he does not believe they exist. He touched the small of her back. He spoke across her to the group as though Marcus were furniture. He told a story about a helicopter he had chartered in Ibiza and let the silence after it settle over the table like a dropped tablecloth. Marcus sat across from him and said almost nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, because he was watching. He watched the way Damien's eyes flickered to check the room's reaction after every line. He watched the way the man's hands moved, always performing, always angled toward an audience. He watched Vanessa's face and felt something finalize inside him, like a door, closing slowly and then clicking shut without drama. Her friends were already nudging each other. Jade leaned over to Vanessa and said, not quite quietly enough. He literally looks like he stepped out of a magazine. Marcus heard it. He picked up his beer, took a long, measured sip, and set it back down without changing his expression. The following week, Damien rented the private dining room at a restaurant on the Magnificent Mile, all floor-to-ceiling windows and candlelight, and a string quartet that played near the entrance exclusively for Vanessa and himself. Vanessa posted a single photograph to her story, a champagne flute against the Chicago skyline at night. Within the hour, 37 people had responded. By the time Marcus saw it, he already knew what it meant. Vanessa had stopped answering his texts with the same warmth. Her replies had gotten shorter, more distant, carrying the particular cool quality of someone who has already made a decision but hasn't yet found the moment to announce it. Marcus noticed all of it. He simply kept cooking. He kept showing up early, kept staying late, kept pressing his palm gently to the back of a new prep cook who was nervous on her first service and telling her she was doing well. And then one evening, Vanessa said it plainly, standing in his kitchen while he was seasoning a pan. "I'm tired of pretending to be happy when I know I could have more." She did not look at him when she said it. She was looking at her phone. Marcus turned off the burner, set down the pan, and looked at her for a long time. "More than what?" he asked. She did not answer. She picked up her bag and walked to the door, and at the threshold she paused and said, without looking back, "I'm having dinner with Damien on Saturday." Marcus Hill spent the next 3 days planning something beautiful. Not out of desperation, he had moved past desperation into a quieter territory, something closer to clarity. He planned it because it was the kind of man he was. Thorough, careful, someone who finished things with the same care with which he began them. He contacted a few of Vanessa's closest friends and told them he wanted to arrange a surprise birthday celebration for her. Her birthday was still 2 weeks away, but the reservation at a small, well-regarded restaurant in the West Loop needed to be made in advance. He ordered her favorite flowers, cream-colored ranunculus and eucalyptus, arranged simply, without pretense. He planned a 4-course dinner built around every dish she had ever mentioned. Loving a soup she had told him reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, a pasta with brown butter and sage that she had once described as the best thing she had ever tasted, a slow-roasted duck breast, and a chocolate tart so carefully made that the ganache had the exact consistency of something you felt guilty eating alone. He cooked all of it himself, over 2 days, with the precision and intention he brought to everything. He set the table himself. He arranged the flowers himself. He drove to the restaurant in the Civic and carried everything in by hand. Vanessa arrived at 7:15. She was not alone. Damien Cole walked through the door 2 steps behind her, one hand resting at the curve of her back, wearing an expression that belonged to a man who had already concluded the evening was going to be easy. Behind them came Jade and 2 other friends, their faces carrying the complicated guilt of people who knew something was wrong but had decided the spectacle was more interesting than the discomfort. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms do when something irreversible is about to happen. Marcus stood at the center of the table, next to the flowers he had arranged, in front of the food he had spent 2 days preparing. He looked at Vanessa. She looked back at him, and then looked away, and that small, averted glance carried more information than any sentence she could have spoken. She said it directly, in front of all of them, with a steadiness that surprised even Marcus in its finality. She said she had been unhappy for a long time. She said she needed a life that matched her ambitions. And then, with a clarity that she seemed to have rehearsed, she said, "You will always just be a chef standing behind a kitchen door, Marcus. That is your world. It is not mine." The room was absolutely silent. Jade stared at the table. Damien Cole stood slightly to Vanessa's right with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching Marcus with the evaluating calm of someone watching a chess piece be removed from a board. Then he reached into his pocket, produced a folded stack of bills, and placed it on the table next to the ranunculus. Slowly, deliberately, like a man making a point with money, the way others make points with words. "For the trouble," Damien said. Marcus looked at the money on the table. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at Damien. Something passed across his face in those few seconds. Not rage, not humiliation, not grief, though all 3 had a claim to the space. It was something older and cooler than any of those things. It was recognition. the clear, uncluttered recognition of a man who understands exactly what is in front of him and is no longer surprised by it. He did not pick up the money. He did not raise his voice. He did not say anything at all for a long moment. Then he straightened his shoulders, turned quietly, and walked through the kitchen door. Terrell, the dishwasher from Ember and Salt, was the only person in the back. He had come along to help with setup and was rinsing a prep bowl when Marcus walked in. He looked up, read the situation in Marcus's face immediately, and said nothing. Marcus leaned against the stainless steel counter, took 3 slow breaths, and then pulled out his phone. He scrolled to a number he had not called in 6 weeks. He pressed dial. When the line picked up, he spoke quietly, without preamble, without anger. "I'm ready to stop waiting. Tell the board we're moving on everything. All of it." He ended the call, slid the phone into his pocket, and stood in the quiet of that kitchen for another 30 seconds. Then he picked up a clean towel, folded it in thirds, and set it on the counter, with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. He did not go back into the dining room. The building at 412 North Michigan Avenue was the kind of address that existed in a city's skyline as a statement rather than a location. 42 floors of glass and steel, a lobby with 14-foot ceilings, and a reception desk staffed by people who moved with the quiet efficiency of those who understand that their environment projects power, so they do not have to. Marcus Hill walked through the revolving door on a Monday morning in a charcoal suit, no tie, the jacket perfectly cut, shoes that were expensive in the way that only people who truly understood quality could identify. He rode the elevator to the 38th floor. When the doors opened, 4 people were already standing in the corridor waiting for him. Not waiting the way people wait for a scheduled meeting. Waiting the way people wait for someone whose arrival matters. The conference room was already arranged. 12 chairs, half of them occupied by people in their 40s and 50s, who had the specific bearing of those accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room until now. Marcus sat at the head of the table, accepted a folder from his chief operating officer, a precise and brilliant woman named Diana Weston, who had been running the operation for 3 years, and began to speak. Not loudly, not with performance, simply, directly, with the focused authority of a man who had earned every word he was about to say. The company was called Hillflame Group. It did not advertise. It did not need to. In the 9 years since Marcus had incorporated it, with $140,000 of his own savings money, he had accrued working kitchen jobs since he was 16, supplemented by 2 small investors who had believed in him before anyone else had reason to. Hill Flame had grown into a privately held restaurant empire with 47 locations across 11 cities, 3 Michelin-starred properties, a culinary education foundation, and a hospitality supply division that serviced more than 300 independent restaurants across the Midwest and Eastern Seaboard. The company's valuation, as of the previous fiscal year's independent assessment, sat at just under $400 million. Marcus Hill owned 63% of it. He had continued working as a line chef later, as head chef at Ember and Salt for the past 3 years as a deliberate exercise. He wanted to understand what the daily experience of his employees felt like from the inside. He wanted to understand margin pressure, supply chain friction, the specific exhaustion of a double shift, the small humiliations of being managed badly. He never told anyone at the restaurant who he was. He punched in. He cooked. He swept the back entrance. He sat with Terrell and ate staff meal. And everything he observed went directly into the operating philosophy of Hill Flame Group, a company renowned in industry circles for its treatment of employees, its retention rates, and a management culture that people in the hospitality industry talked about, the way people in other industries talked about legends. Diana slid a single-page summary across the table. Marcus reviewed it without expression. 3 of Hillflame's supply contracts were with companies in Damian Cole's business network. Not with Damian directly, but with firms that depended on his development projects for their commercial real estate, which in turn provided the physical infrastructure for their distribution. It was an indirect dependency, but in the specific ecosystem of Chicago's commercial hospitality sector, it was load-bearing. Diana looked at Marcus across the table. "How would you like to proceed?" she asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for one moment, and then said, "We don't do anything." We simply let the contracts expire on their natural timeline and decline to renew. No announcements, no statements, just routine business decisions. He paused. I want to be very clear, this is not about coal. This is about realigning our supplier relationships with our long-term growth strategy. That is the only story anyone in this building ever tells about it. Diana nodded. She understood what that meant. It meant the same outcome, accomplished with complete deniability and without a single act of aggression, which was, as it happened, far more effective than aggression would have been. Marcus smiled then, just slightly, just at the corner of his mouth. And Diana, he added, tell the Paris team we're ready to move forward on the Marais location. The Chicago Culinary Excellence Awards were held every year in the Grand Ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton, and they were one of those events that managed to be simultaneously about food and not about food at all. Mostly about who was seen, who was wearing what, and where exactly in the room one was seated, which communicated a precise social and professional status to anyone who spoke the language. Damian Cole attended because he had sponsored a minor award category, which entitled him to a table near the front and afforded him the opportunity to be photographed alongside people more interesting than himself. He arrived in the Lamborghini, made an entrance at the right moment, and found his table without incident. He did not immediately notice Marcus. There was no reason he would have the man he had assessed at that bar in Lincoln Park as a nonentity was not someone he had catalogued in his memory as worth recognizing at an event of this caliber. When he did eventually see him, it was because the woman seated next to him, a restaurant critic for a national magazine whose approval could alter the trajectory of a chef's career, leaned toward her companion and said something that made both of them look toward the far side of the room with expressions of unmistakable recognition. Damien followed their gaze. Marcus was standing near the bar in a black tuxedo. Not a rented one, the kind of tuxedo that has been built specifically for one person's body and carries, in its precise construction, the quiet announcement of someone who understands that certain garments are investments rather than expenses. He was speaking with the mayor of Chicago, and the mayor was laughing, genuinely laughing, not the performative laughter of political events, but the kind of laughter that happens when someone has said something genuinely delightful. Around them, within a 10-foot radius, were three of the most prominent restaurateurs in the city, a James Beard Foundation board member, and a venture capital partner, whose fund had backed four of the most successful food and beverage companies in the country in the past 6 years. Damian Cole stared. Something in his chest did a complicated thing, a slow, downward rearrangement of the certainty he had walked in with. He looked at Marcus the way a man looks at something that does not compute, something that refuses to fit the category he had already assigned it to. He turned to the woman next to him and asked, with a carefully casual voice that did not quite succeed at casual, "Do you know who that is? The man in the black tux?" The woman looked at him with the faint surprise of someone being asked the name of the son. "Marcus Hill," she said simply. "Hill Flame Group. He's the primary sponsor of tonight's event." The ballroom lights dimmed. The master of ceremonies took the stage, and before the first award was announced, the MC offered a brief introduction of the evening's headline benefactor. A man, he said, whose contribution to culinary culture in this city and across the country represented not only extraordinary financial investment, but a genuinely transformative vision. A man who had chosen to build an empire quietly, who understood that the greatest luxury is never needing to announce your arrival. The screen behind the stage filled with a photograph of Marcus Hill, not in chef's whites this time, but in a boardroom, behind a desk that looked over the Chicago skyline, with the calm, settled expression of a man who had been exactly where he intended to be for quite some time. The applause that filled the room was not polite event applause. It was the real kind. Vanessa, seated 3 tables behind Damien, pressed her hand to her mouth. Damian Cole sat very still, his champagne glass halfway to his lips, and did not drink. What happened to Damian Cole's business in the months that followed was not dramatic in the way that financial disasters are sometimes depicted. No single catastrophic moment, no press conference announcing collapse, no enemy standing over the wreckage making a speech. It was quieter than that, and in many ways worse. The supply chain relationships that had underpinned 3 of his development projects renegotiated their terms when the Hill Flame contracts expired and were not renewed. It did not kill the projects immediately, but it created a load-bearing crack in the foundation of his cash flow projections, the kind of crack that, once present, tends to spread under pressure. Two investors who had been planning to enter a new development deal with him began asking questions that previously would not have occurred to them. A third pulled out without explanation, citing a reallocation of portfolio priorities. Damien was not a man who had built his wealth on genuine depth. He had built it on performance, on the perception of wealth generating the conditions for actual wealth, which is a viable strategy right up until the moment it is not. When the perception began to slip, even slightly, the actual foundations revealed themselves to be thinner than anyone looking at the surface would have guessed. His stock, in a publicly traded hospitality real estate investment trust he had positioned, as evidence of his diversification, dropped 14% over 6 weeks, on news that had nothing directly to do with him, but that hit his sector. Across the board, it was not a ruin, but it was a wobble. And Damien Cole, who had survived on confidence for the better part of a decade, discovered that he did not know what to do when confidence was not enough. The media, meanwhile, had become interested in Marcus Hill, in the way that media becomes interested in things once they have been given permission to find them interesting. A profile in a national food magazine described him as the most quietly powerful man in American dining. A business publication ran a piece about Hill Flame Group's financials, obtained through public filings, that placed the company's growth trajectory in the top 5% of privately held hospitality groups in the placed country. The piece spent considerable time on Marcus's decision to continue working as a kitchen employee while running his company, framing it as an act of radical operational intelligence. 3 television networks reached out about documentary projects. Marcus declined all of them. Vanessa read every word. She followed the coverage with the consuming attention of someone who is trying to measure the exact distance between the life she had and the life she had chosen not to have. She thought about the birthday dinner, the ranunculus, the brown butter pasta, the way he had looked at her when Damien put the money on the table, that cool and ancient and absolutely clear-eyed look. She thought about the 2 years she had spent being ashamed of the Civic and the chef's whites, of the easy warmth he offered everyone around him, of the steadiness she had decided was a ceiling rather than a foundation. She thought about all of it, until thinking about it became a kind of punishment she administered to herself every day. And then she drove to his building on a Tuesday night, in late November, when it was cold and wet, and the streets were carrying the specific melancholy of a city at the end of autumn. She stood at his door for 4 minutes before she rang. He opened it looking exactly as he always had, the plain white shirt, the calm, the eyes that saw too much and showed too little. He looked at her for a moment, and then stepped back to let her in without a word. She sat at his kitchen table, the same table where she had once told him she was tired of pretending. She had been crying in the car on the way over, and the evidence of it was still on her face, which was somehow worse than the crying itself, because it meant she had already lost the composure she had planned to arrive with. She told him she was sorry. She told him she had let herself be seduced by something that looked like the life she wanted and turned out to be a very expensive, very convincing photograph of that life. She told him that Damien was not who she had believed him to be, that the car was leased, that the penthouse was mortgaged beyond any reasonable equity, that the watch collection was real but represented nearly everything solid he actually owned. She said she had found out slowly. The way you find things out when you are paying attention to the wrong things for too long and then suddenly, all at once, begin paying attention to the right ones. Marcus poured 2 glasses of water and placed one in front of her. He sat down. He listened to everything she said without interrupting, without the small sounds of acknowledgement that people offer when they want someone to feel heard. He simply listened fully, completely, in the way he had always done everything, which had once felt like peace and now, in this context, felt more like verdict. When she finished, she looked at him with the careful hope of someone who has placed something fragile on a surface they are not sure will hold. She said, very quietly, "I never stopped loving you. I want you to know that. Whatever I did, it was never about not loving you." Marcus looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her steadily, without cruelty, without the theatrics of a man enjoying a reversal of power. When he spoke, his voice was low and even. He said, "Vanessa, you didn't stop loving me. That's probably true. But love and respect are not the same thing. You were ashamed of me. Not sometimes consistently, In public, in front of your friends, with a man who you knew was interested in you, you were ashamed of who I was and what I did. That shame had nothing to do with my bank account. It had everything to do with how you measured the value of a person. He paused. When Damien put that money on my table, you said nothing. That told me everything I needed to know, not about him, about you. He looked at her for another long moment. You didn't love me. You loved what it felt like when someone you respected noticed you. And I could never be that person for you, because you had already decided what kind of person I was. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind pushed rain against the window in a slow, steady rhythm. Vanessa looked at the glass of water in front of her. She did not argue with a single word he had said, because she recognized all of it. I'm not angry, Marcus added. I'm just clear. She nodded, very slightly, and that small nod held in it something heavier than any word she could have found. She was still sitting at the table when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, and her face changed in a way that Marcus noticed immediately. It's Damien, she said. He says he needs to talk to me. He sounds. She stopped. He sounds desperate. Damien Cole appeared at Marcus's building 40 minutes later. He had, evidently, gotten the address from Vanessa, who had not fully thought through the sequence of events before responding to his message. He arrived looking like a version of himself that had been left out in the rain, the suit still expensive, still well cut, but worn with the disheveled urgency of a man who had been in it for too many hours, the tie loosened, the eyes carrying the specific brightness of someone who had consumed something to manage their anxiety and was now managing the thing they had consumed. He smelled, faintly, of bourbon. Marcus opened the door and regarded him with the unhurried calm of a man who is standing on solid ground and watching someone else's boat take on water. Come in, he said, not warmly, not coldly, simply, as a fact. Damien came in and stood in the living room without taking off his coat, which gave the impression of a man who had not decided whether he was staying or fleeing. He looked around the apartment, which was, in the manner of everything that belonged to Marcus, beautifully simple and quietly expensive, in ways that only revealed themselves slowly. A piece of ceramic on the shelf, a single painting, bookshelves that told a story about an interior life rather than an impression. Damien stared at a specific detail, a photograph on the wall. Marcus shaking hands with a figure Damien slowly recognized as the CEO of a company that had, the previous year, been listed among the top private equity acquisitions in the hospitality sector. The cognitive dissonance on his face was something Marcus did not rush him through. Then Damien did something Marcus had not anticipated. He sat down on the couch, put his elbows on his knees, and covered his face with his hands. When he took his hands away, there was no performance in his expression, no calculation, no appraisal of the room's reaction. Just a man who had arrived at the end of a strategy he had believed was permanent and found it wasn't. I need help, Damien said. The words came out simple and stripped, without any of the architecture of his usual self-presentation. I have 230 employees, people who have been with me for years. If the two developments collapse, every single one of them loses their job. Not just me. I know what I did. I know how I treated you. And I know you don't owe me anything. But those 230 people didn't do anything to you. He looked at Marcus directly. I'm asking you. Not for me. For them. The room was very quiet. Vanessa, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watched Marcus, with an attention so complete she had stopped breathing. Marcus remained standing. He looked at Damien Cole, this man who had thrown money on a table over the body of his dignity, who had spoken across him like furniture, who had helped Vanessa construct the case for his own irrelevance, and he did something that neither of them expected. He sat down in the chair across from him. He leaned forward. He spoke quietly, directly, in the voice of a man who has already decided. Tell me exactly what you need. He said, not for you. Understand that. But yes, what Marcus Hill did with Damien Cole's failing company in the weeks that followed became, in the specific circles that paid attention to such things, one of those stories that gets passed around as an example of something people are not quite sure how to name grace, or intelligence, or the long game, or simply a refusal to let someone else's smallness define the limits of your own behavior. He did not bail Damien out. He was clear about that distinction in every conversation, every document, every negotiation. What he did was orchestrate an acquisition, a structured purchase of the two distressed development properties, at a price that was fair by every independent assessment, slightly below market, given the circumstances but not punitive, and that contained within its terms the guarantee of employment continuity for every single person on Damien's payroll who wanted to stay. Damien Cole retained nothing except his personal assets, which were more modest than his public persona had implied, but not nothing. He lost the Lamborghini, which had been leased anyway. He retained the watch collection. He received a consulting contract from the new entity, a modest one, a genuine one, for the specific operational knowledge he possessed about two Chicago neighborhoods where the developments were located. It was not charity. It was efficient. Marcus had learned long ago that the most effective thing you could do with someone's humiliation was decline to participate in it. Destruction, he told Diana Weston in a brief conversation after the paperwork was signed, is the least interesting thing you can do with power. He also announced, on the same week the acquisition closed, the launch of the Hill Flame Foundation's inaugural scholarship class, 12 young cooks between the ages of 18 and 24, selected from communities across the south side and west side of Chicago, each receiving full funding for culinary education and a 2-year paid apprenticeship at a Hill Flame property. The announcement did not mention Damien Cole. It did not mention Vanessa. It did not reference any of what had happened in the months prior. It simply said that Marcus Hill believed the best food in the world came from people whose relationship to cooking had been built on necessity and love, and that it was his intention to make sure those people had every door opened for them that had once been opened for him, and every door that had not. Vanessa saw the announcement on a gray December morning. She was sitting in a coffee shop in Wicker Park, 3 blocks from Ember and Salt, reading the news on her phone. She read the entire press release twice. She thought about the brown butter pasta, the ranunculus, the quiet of his kitchen in those early hours when he stood there with his coffee and his thoughts. She thought about how long she had mistaken his silence for emptiness when it had been, all along, the fullness of a man who did not need to perform his substance because he actually possessed it. She did not cry. She simply sat very still, in the way you sit when you have understood something that cannot be undone, and drank her coffee down to the cold dregs at the bottom of the cup. Damien Cole, for his part, showed up to his first day as a consulting contractor in a pair of ordinary slacks and a jacket that was nice but not performative. He nodded at the project manager. He sat at a shared desk. He did not mention the Lamborghini. Nobody asked. The restaurant occupied a narrow building on a corner in Le Marais, Paris's 4th arrondissement, a neighborhood of ancient streets and contemporary art, and the specific light that falls on the Seine in the late afternoon, in a way that has convinced painters and poets for 3 centuries that this particular quality of illumination is worth an entire life. The space had been renovated from what had been a 19th century printing house, and its bones, the iron columns, the high ceilings, the arched windows had been preserved and built around with the same philosophy Marcus brought to food. Respect what already exists, improve what needs improving, never destroy for the sake of novelty. The kitchen was open. The tables were made of dark oak. The menu changed every 48 hours based on what was available from the 3 farms and 2 fishmongers Marcus had contracted with directly. There was no name on the awning yet. That was intentional. It would open, and people would find it, and they would come because of what was on the plate, and the name would mean something because of that, rather than the other way around. Marcus stood at the pass on a Tuesday afternoon in January, 4 weeks before the opening, watching his team of 8 cooks move through the space, with the focused, wordless communication of a kitchen that had begun to find its rhythm. He was in his whites, no tuxedo, no boardroom suit, just the plain, practical uniform of someone whose actual work was this: a sharp knife, a clean board, a pan over a fire, and the endless, patient, glorious problem of making something out of raw ingredients that would cause a person to close their eyes and, for one moment, be entirely present in their own life. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen on the south side, which had smelled of bay leaves and onion and something slower and more complicated that he had never been able to identify exactly, but had spent 20 years trying to recreate. He thought about the first restaurant where he had worked, at 16, washing dishes for $7 an hour, and the chef who had caught him watching the cooks from the dish station and had not sent him away, but had instead pulled him forward and put a knife in his hand. He thought about the Civic, which he still owned, and drove occasionally out of a sentiment he was not embarrassed by. He thought about the dented quarter panel that he still had not fixed. He did not think about Vanessa, not exactly, but he thought about what she had inadvertently given him. The clarity of being fully seen by someone and fully dismissed, and the discovery that the dismissal did not diminish him. He had known his own value for a long time. But there is a difference between knowing your value and having tested it against the worst version of what people can offer: indifference, contempt, the casual cruelty of someone deciding you are not worth the effort of seeing clearly. He had been tested and had not bent. And in not bending, he had discovered something he had suspected, but not yet confirmed, that the foundation was real, that it had been real all along. He was in the middle of this thought when the sous chef, a 26-year-old woman from Lyon named Elise, who had the precise, efficient movements and the quiet ferocity of someone who would, within 10 years, run her own kitchen and probably earn a star doing it, appeared at his elbow with a question about the sourcing for next week's poultry. Marcus turned and looked at her, at the seriousness in her face, the focused intelligence in her eyes, the way she held her notebook like a weapon, and felt something settle warmly in his chest. This was the work. This had always been the work. "Tell the farmer in Bresse we want the smaller birds," he said. "Tell him we'll pay his rate, and tell him we want them hung for 3 days before delivery." Elise wrote it down. "Also," Marcus added, and something in his voice shifted, softened, became the voice he used when he was about to say something that mattered. "You ran the amuse-bouche service yesterday without being asked. The timing was perfect. The team followed your lead. That's what I'm looking for. Keep doing that." Elise looked at him, registered the weight of what he had just said, and nodded once, precisely, in the manner of someone filing something important. She returned to the kitchen. He stood at the pass for a while longer. Through the arched windows, the light was turning the particular color it turns in Le Marais, in January, low and amber and extraordinary, a light that had seen so much it had nothing left to prove. Outside, Paris moved with its ancient, unhurried rhythm. Inside, his kitchen moved with its own. Back in Chicago, a television was on in the background of a small apartment in Logan Square, and on the screen, a segment on a morning show was showing footage of a new Paris restaurant and its American-born chef and founder. A reporter was asking Marcus how he felt about the journey from the south side of Chicago to a corner in Le Marais, and Marcus was looking at the camera with the calm, settled expression of a man who does not need the question answered because he already knows the answer and has known it for a long time. "I've always cooked for the same reason," he said, "because it's honest work. Because when you feed someone something true, they feel it. That doesn't change based on what's outside the building." Vanessa watched the segment in its entirety. She turned the television off. She sat in the quiet for a long time. Then she smiled, not the bright, curated smile she had once practiced for rooms full of people trying to impress each other, but a smaller, realer one. The kind you allow yourself when you finally understand something it took too long to understand. And the understanding is sharp, but also, in its way, a gift. Somewhere across the city, Damian Cole was commuting on the Blue Line, reading something on his phone, dressed in ordinary slacks. The Lamborghini was gone. The penthouse was being refinanced. The watch collection was still in its case. He was learning, slowly and with difficulty, that presence did not require performance, which was a lesson he should have learned years earlier, but was, as it turned out, not too late to learn now. And Marcus Hill stood in a kitchen in Paris, in the light that painters have spent centuries trying to capture, adjusting the seasoning in a sauce with the focused patience of a man who has always understood that the most important things are done quietly. His phone was in his office. The board could wait, the press could wait, everything could wait. There was a sauce on the fire, and it needed his full attention, and that, in the end, was what had always been true. The work was the thing. The work had always been the thing. They thought he was just a chef standing behind a kitchen door, until he owned the entire building. And long after the door had been opened, and the building had been bought, and the empire had been quietly built, and the people who had dismissed him had found their way to reckoning with what they had dismissed after all of that. Marcus Hill was still in the kitchen, still tasting, still adjusting, still cooking like it mattered, because it did, because it always had, because that was where he had always been most completely himself. And that, finally, was the whole truth of him.